My name is Ron Carrico, and I'm a docent here at the San Diego Air and Space Museum. And it's January the 17th in 2018, and I'm with Army Major Dudley Oatman, retired, and he's going to tell about his experiences flying helicopters. Where were you born?
Here in San Diego.
And what did your parents do?
My dad was a manager at North Island Naval Air Station, and he had. I remember my mom. Every time we'd go out there, he'd say, "See that building over there? That was your daddy's building." And then he passed away when I was 10. And then, but my mom also worked out there. In fact, she was one of the original Rosie the Riveters.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she did the rivets on B-24 in between the 3 and 4 engines.
Where were you? What year were you born?
46.
So you entered the Army when?
66.
Was it because you wanted to be an aviator, or?
Yep.
And why the Army instead of the Navy or Air Force or Marines?
I had just a little over 2 years of college at the time, and I had an event when I was working as an engineer aide between high school and college at North Island, and one of the projects that my engineer that I was assigned to had, we'd finished it and he had to test it, so we went up to Miramar. So we'd go into North Island and we would hop aboard a helicopter and they would fly us up to Miramar in the morning, and in the afternoon they would fly us back. And that's when I decided that my interest in aviation had been long-standing, but that's when I decided I needed to learn how to fly if I could. But the Navy required 4 years of college, and I had just a little over 2. I went to the Air Force, and they had 4-year same. And then I went to the Army, and they said, you only need 2 years. You've got that, and you'll be flying helicopters, maybe fixed wing and stuff like that, and we'll guarantee you to get into flight school. And I said, it sounds like a good deal to me.
So what was your first day in the Army then?
My first
day?
I don't know. Which
what year? What year?
It was December '66, basic training, Fort Polk, Louisiana.
Okay. Did they have class designations?
They did, yeah, for flight school.
What was your class?
I started off in class 6719.
So did that would be the graduation date. So were you an officer the whole time, or
nope. I went through what they call the Warrant Officer Candidate Program.
Okay.
So we were officially WOC, W-O-C.
Okay.
And after basic training, that was our advanced individual training, was flight school. So I went from Fort Polk. In fact, my wife came out. We got married in Fort Polk. And then we went to Fort Walters in Texas.
Okay, so let me get this straight. So you start off as an enlisted guy or start off as a walk?
Enlisted.
Enlisted. And
yeah.
At what point did you become a warrant officer?
When we signed into flight school.
Ah, okay.
Well, not warrant officer. That's when we officially became a walk. And then at graduation, we were appointed warrant officers and then given our wings.
What does warrant officer mean?
That's a technical officer grade. So most pilots in the Army were warrant officers. There were a lot of commissioned officers that were pilots also, but primarily the technical or standards pilots, or training pilots and stuff, they were all warrant officers. We had 4 grades of them.
And warrant officers do other things as well, right?
No, they're pretty much specialized in aviation.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that.
Now, they had warrant officers for the Army's vessels, tugboats and stuff like that, port operations. That's all under Army purview.
Okay.
And that's where I think that's where the warrant officer rank started. But then they adapted it to aviation once the Air Force broke off in '47.
If you're an officer, you have a commission from the government.
Yes.
Meaning you're commissioned. So then a warrant means it's for a particular thing, I guess.
It's an appointment.
Yeah. Okay.
You're not commissioned, because when I received a direct commission when I was a W-2 warrant officer, chief warrant officer, and you get a commission, by act of Congress and President and all that other stuff. But for the warrants, it's an appointment. It is an officer grade. It's senior to all the enlisted grades, but it's a specialist grade.
Okay, so then you graduate from from the pilot training,
Mm-hmm.
and the airplanes you flew in pilot training.
The flight school for the Army was 9 months, and we started off at Fort Walters, Texas, which is just west of Fort Worth. And we did 1 month of pre-flight, which was the equivalent of the West Point plebe, or whatever they called it. It was pure harassment. The first month was teaching you how to be an officer, what, the customs and courtesies of the service and all that kind of stuff, leadership. And then once you got through pre-flight, then you went what we called up on the hill. It was just a different section of the base, and you started your flight training there, and you did 4 months of flight training, got about 200 flight hours at Fort Walters. And Fort Walters, we had 2 aircraft at that time. We had we call it a TH-55, which is a Hughes 300, and then we had the Hiller OH-23 Raven, which is made by Hiller, nicknamed the Hiller Killer because it was a semi-dangerous airplane. And so we did all of our primary flight training there. So we did, formation flying, the standard traffic patterns, landings, takeoffs, running landings, auto rotations. Not very much navigation, just basic navigation, and the emergency procedures and confined areas. So we would fly around the countryside in Texas, and you find a hole in the trees, and you'd land the helicopter in the hole and then take it off again. That's the advantage of the helicopter. Don't need a runway. So then after 4 months of that, we went to Fort Rucker, Alabama, near Dothan, and we went through the advanced flight training there, where we all flew Hueys. A, B, some C models, but all Hueys.
So now you have a lot of airplane flying time.
I'm sorry?
You have a lot of airplane flying time.
Yes. Well, I don't know what a lot means. I've got probably at least 9,500 hours, and then
That's a lot.
probably a couple thousand in a simulator.
So what's the most significant difference between flying an airplane with wings and a helicopter that has a rotating wing?
What they're capable of. The helicopter is capable and utilized a lot low level. In a military sense, we would, such as in Viet Nam, we would have what we call a package with the air cav. We'd send out 2 Hughes 500s, or we call them the OH-6, and they would actually fly around in the trees looking for the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. And once they would find something, then we would have 2 Cobras at 3,000 feet, at least 2. A heavy fire team would be 3, and they would immediately roll inbound. So the OH-6, the scouts, or Loach as we called them, would fly around until they could get somebody to shoot at them. So they were basically
Stupid.
a lot of my fixed-wing buddies say that to fly a helicopter is basically stupid because we sort of beat the air into submission. But that was the mission that we had there. And
So now when you're actually flying a helicopter, I mean, I don't know. I'd count on those who watches these things. But you have a stick.
mm-hmm.
You pull back and forth.
Yep.
And you have rudders.
Yep.
And you have a thing in your left hand.
Call it collective.
And how do all these things relate?
Okay.
Let's start with the rudders. What does a rudder do?
The rudder changes the pitch on the tail rudder. So you have an aircraft. You've got this big rudder blade going around. When you start to pull pitch or increase the pitch of the rotor blades to lift off the ground, that causes an equal and opposite torque on the fuselage of the aircraft. So the blade's going around like this, counterclockwise from looking from the top. Well, the fuselage wants to turn clockwise until it matches the speed of the rotor blades. Tail rotor is what counteracts that force. So basically it's your heading, left and right. But it's almost exclusively used at hover. Once you get forward airspeed, then your vertical stabilizer in the back starts taking over that responsibility. You still have
There's a vertical
control.
stabilizer?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
Now
So-
okay, so now what is the The thing you call the collective. Why do you call it a collective? Why not a throttle or something?
Because it collectively changes the pitch of the rotor blades, of the main rotor blades. And it has a twist grip on the end, which is the throttle.
Right.
So like a motorcycle throttle twist grip, there's a twist grip there. So you have engine power control, and you can change the pitch of the main rotor blades.
I have the experience of flying a helicopter once out at San Nicolas Island. The airplane I was in was broken down. We were sitting there after, and some Navy guy came in, guys, and we started talking. I said, "Hey, can I fly your airplane?" And the guy said, "Yeah, sure, let's go." So he put me in the left seat. And we took off, and he explained everything to me.
And you survived?
It was pretty easy, I think. I didn't. It was not anything difficult. The only thing difficult for me was when I'd come around the final turn. I had a tendency from riding motorcycles to turn the collective the wrong way. And suddenly go, whoa, shit! Oh, now that's right. I'll do it that way. You know? But I could, I could hover it, and it was just like flying down final. And it's kind of like a jet. You want to go fast, you push the stick forward.
That's it.
It's sort of very. It was. Yeah. I thought it was.
Except you go down, so you have to push the stick forward and apply a little extra.
But I thought
so
it was.
It's all, and that's what most of us enjoyed about the helicopters. Fixed wing. When I got transitioned into the fixed wing aircraft, I liked it because I could take off from a runway with very low clouds or fog, and I could fly all the way to another city, another state, another country, and do an instrument approach and land, and never see the Earth in between those 2 points. And that always was a challenge. I thought was a great challenge, and that's what I enjoyed about the fixed wing.
So now, you ended up flying the Huey Cobra. Is that what you call it?
Yep.
What is the designation of it?
AH-1. And there were several different models.
Yeah, okay. So, and the one we have downstairs is?
It is technically it's an E model, but everything after the S model, AH-1S, are all configurations of armament or electronics. And so it has the 20 millimeter Vulcan cannon in the front turret, and that's what designates it primarily. There's some other things too. But that's what designates it as an E model. We started off with a G model, which was the very first one, and I flew some of the. I went through the first Cobra transition class in the United States for the Cobra.
Transition meaning?
Meaning you transition from the UH-1 Huey to the AH-1 Cobra.
So you started off in the Huey then?
Everybody did. All Army pilots graduate flying the Huey. At least back then.
And then, so how were you selected to fly the hot rod?
I was fortunate enough to graduate number 2 in my flight school class, so they gave us what they called an additional rating. And myself and the guy who graduated number 3 chose a Cobra, so he and I went out to Hunter Army Airfield in Georgia.
So one more thing before I forget it.
Sure.
Is there instrumentation, like is there an ILS or VOR?
Oh yeah, fully instrumented.
So you'd have an ILS, you'd fly an ILS if you need to.
Yep.
Oh.
And in fact, it was a little more challenging than in fixed wing because you had to be certified as a single pilot ILS or a single pilot instrument. Because you had, your co-pilot is in the front seat, so you don't have anybody to tune radios for you. So you have to do all of that stuff yourself. You have to think ahead of the approach.
What's so hard about that?
Nothing. But that's what the military required.
Yeah, okay, sure, I guess, yeah. Well, I mean, the F4, we didn't have an ILS. And we flew nothing but GCAs, and they don't even have GCAs anymore. I don't know what they do with those airplanes now, so.
ILSs are pretty easy.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And you just, and nowadays with the electronics, you just couple your flight director with the autopilot, and the airplane flies it for you.
I'm sure they didn't do that with helicopters, did they?
No, they didn't even have autopilots until the mid-'80s.
Yeah. Okay, so you get into the Cobra training, and was that an extensive length of time?
I'm thinking it was probably 30 days.
Now this is when you're going to have to learn to use the gun and the rockets.
Yeah. We actually learned that in flight school. We had B model gunships in flight school, and we were taught the basics, how to shoot a rocket, how to shoot a...
Well, did they have rockets that fired forward?
Yep.
But did they have guns that fired forward?
They did.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I always just think of the door gunner guys.
The door gunner has additional guns. In fact, my first tour, the aircraft that I was shot in we were a Cobra company, but
Why would anybody shoot you? You seem like a nice guy.
you know, it was my own fault because I was shooting rockets at them, and
Yeah.
they just shot back. It's a silly thing, but they did it. But we kept 2 B model gunships in our company because our Cobras, we found out the attitude indicators were failing very rapidly, and so we grounded them for night flying. So any of our night missions we would do on our B model gunships because it turns out Bell ran out of attitude indicators for helicopters, and so they put fixed wing attitude indicators in, which couldn't take the vibration, and they were failing.
Yeah.
And so I was doing a last light recon in a B model gunship when we got a call on guard to go over to a place called Utah Beach. I knew where it was real close. And so we went over there and we started shooting at them, and they started shooting back.
What'd you shoot at in the dark?
It wasn't dark quite.
Oh.
It was just getting that way. We had 2, and I can't remember if they were Marine Dustoffs, medical evacuation Hueys, or if they were Army Dustoffs. Really doesn't matter. We had 2 medical evacuation Hueys, and they were on the ground, and they were starting to take fire, and they didn't want to come out of their little hole that they were in without some suppression, so they'd make a call on guard, and that was a pretty standard procedure. I was in the air. I heard the call. I knew it was close. I talked to my dispatch. They dispatched the standby gun, but I immediately went over there and laid down suppression fire while the ships got out, and then
Describe that. What does that mean? How would you do it? They're sitting on the ground.
They're sitting on the ground.
Engines running, waiting for you to.
Yep.
And what do you do?
And they were on the edge of a clearing. There was a canal it wasn't really a canal, it was a river, a small river, and then on the other side of the river was some pretty dense forest. And they were in the clearing, and the Viet Cong were in the trees and the forest on the other side of that little river, and they were shooting across at the ground troops and at the medical evacuation helicopters, the Dustoffs we call them. And so,
hold on a second. First of all, let's give me a date. About when?
April 1968, April 23rd actually.
And so and where was it in Vietnam?
On the coast.
On the coast.
I Corps, way up north.
Okay.
Just south of the DMZ.
Oh, okay. Right.
Around Quin Yon is the big city up.
You just hover and sit still in one place?
No, you don't hover. That makes you a fixed target.
Yeah.
You keep going. So we have trees here, and we have the Dustoffs here. The Dustoffs are going to take off in this direction. So I came in between the Dustoffs and the aggressors, the enemy, because you never want to overfly your own troops in a gunship, because your spent shell casings fall down on top of them and they're hot, and it's just not a good thing to do. So I turned and
that's interesting,
and started a dive, and I did it at sort of an angle so I could put my rockets into the tree line to keep their heads down. And
so these are rockets, or what kind of rockets?
2.75 inch folding fin aerial rockets. Not very accurate. They're good area weapons. And then we also
had the other one when it blows up.
I'm sorry.
When it blows up, how much is an explosion does it make?
In my first tour, we had the 10-pound warheads, which are about the equivalent of an 81 millimeter mortar shell. Second tour, we had the 19-pound warheads, which is like a 105 howitzer round. So they're fairly potent. And then we also had, in our B model gunship, 4 M60 machine guns that were controlled by my left seat, and he could turn them some directions up and down, but basically it was wherever the helicopter was pointing is where they were going to be shooting. So that's why as I was going in and putting rockets into the tree line, my co-pilot was firing the 4 M60 machine guns with his sight. It was a flex sight that moved all around, and so he was spraying the whole area, and then of course the left door gunner was firing his M60 into that tree line also, while the Dustoffs pulled pitch and moved out of there. Then we went out over the beach and we circled around because they were coming back. They had more wounded to pick up. So as they were coming back in, we did the same thing. We just sprayed the tree line to keep Charlie's head down. And those ships got in, got loaded up. By then we had our standby gun had joined up with me, and there we could see that there were the dust-offs were starting to pull pitch because we could see the rotor wash coming down. So I told my crew, I said, the last run, expend, fire up everything we got. And when we did that, and I guess we had done it, I guess that was probably my 4th gun run. Yeah, they figured out what we were going to be doing, and so we started taking a lot of rounds. I mean, I took one round through the chin bubble and hit the leading edge of my armored seat, and fortunately ricocheted downward, and put a couple pieces of shrapnel in my left leg. And then, in fact, the crew chief found the thing laying around in the back, the spent round, and gave it to me. He says, "Here's a souvenir for you." And I thought, "Oh, that's pretty cool." So I put it in my chicken plate in that little pocket. And then I never did recover that one.
Oh.
The story continues. And then on this last turn, they zeroed in on us pretty good. And we, when I was in recovery, the CO came in and said we took 27 30 cal entries and 5 50 cal entries. So they had us targeted pretty well.
Entries mean bullet holes.
Bullet holes that has an entry, because a round can go all the way through an aircraft. So if you can't just count the holes, you'll count one round twice, an entry and an exit. So they just count the entries. Once we get over there, we see the dust-offs, and they describe to us where Charlie is. He's over in the tree line across from a little creek. And the only way that we could get shots at him was to come in at sort of an angle to them, but run basically up and down that creek. So we did that, and I was firing rockets. The right seat usually fires the rockets. The left seat controls the 4 M60 machine guns. So we were keeping Charlie's heads down, the dust-off leave out of there. I think we did 2 runs to get them out. Then we went out, orbited over the beach, and then we came back in when the dust-offs were coming back in. They had more wounded to get. And so we did another pass while they came in and landed, and by this time our backup or our standby gunship had arrived. So I did one pass, and they did one pass. Dust-offs got in, loaded up. We came around in our gun attack mode pattern, and then I did one more pass.
How fast?
Those old B models, we flew them around most of the time around 70 to 80 knots, and then as we would start our actual gun run, we would pick up the airspeed, and we'd probably break off at about 105, 110 knots. 120 was what they called VNE, velocity never exceeds.
Okay. So when you're coming in, I know your door gunner on the left side, he's got to look. He can see what's going on too. So.
Yes, and he's firing, and his gun also.
Do you have 2 door gunners or 1?
2. Door gunner on the left, crew chief on the right.
And you were describing the armor around you.
Yeah, the seats that we had have armor underneath the seat, on the back of the seat, on the sides of the seat, and one round. One of the previous runs had come through the chin bubble or somewhere in that vicinity, hit the leading edge of my armored seat, ricocheted down, put a couple pieces of shrapnel on my left leg, and then my crew chief found that spent bullet and gave it to me, and I put it in the chicken plate pocket on my chicken plate.
Chicken plate means?
Chicken plate was it's like a 22-pound armor plate. It wasn't a flak jacket. It was an armor protection that we would actually sit down. We would put it on our laps, and then we would put our safety harness around that to hold it in position.
Wow.
And they worked quite well, because I took a round just almost right there in my chicken plate, and all I ended up was bruise about that big. Knocked the wind out of me. But.
Yeah.
So anyway, then we came back in, and it was our last run. We could see that the dust-offs were getting ready to leave, and so I told my crew to expend, because this would be our last run. I had 2 more pair of rockets, so I fired those off, and then things started coming through the cockpit, bullets, and I don't know if we got it on the last tape, but we took 27 30 cal entries and 5 50 cal. And my left-hand door gunner took one of the 50 cals, and apparently it came in underneath his chicken plate and went all the way through his body. when exited his body, went through the roof of the helicopter, right where his, we call them a monkey harness. It was a strap that was attached to the overhead, and they wore a harness so that they could lean out with their M60 and shoot. Anyway, it went out through the top of the helicopter, right where his monkey harness was attached, and he exited the airplane. But one of the doctors told me later on that he was already dead, because they found in parts of internal body organs in the overhead, so the round went all the way through him. Anyway, I got hit.
Did you guys fly as a crew?
I'm sorry?
Did you fly as a crew?
Yeah.
A formed crew, so you had 4 guys all
Four guys, yeah.
Okay.
Pilot, co-pilot, and actually we just, we'd flip a coin half the time and see who was going to fly which seat.
Oh, okay.
And then a crew chief and a door gunner. So there's, yeah, a total of 4 of us. And I got hit in the right arm, right just below the elbow, and that bullet went all the way up almost into my armpit. And that's the one that's in the display downstairs. And of course it pulled my hand off the cyclic. In fact, it broke my visor. It hit me. My hand hit me in the face. But that's why we wore the visors. And then my co-pilot saw that I was hit, and things kind of went into slow motion for me, because he looked over at me and then came back and took his hands off the sight, which was balanced, spring-loaded from the overhead, and grabbed the cyclic. And we always trimmed our gunships in a gun run that if the pilot flying gets shot, the airplane will automatically go to wings level and start to climb. And you don't want to start to climb right over the top of the bad guys, because you make a very easy target. So, but that's what happened to the ship. Is we came out of our turn, and all of a sudden it started climbing, because I had been shot. My hand was off the controls now. So he takes him, and he goes to a hard left bank, and that's when he gets shot. And he gets shot through both calves. Didn't hit any bones, no blood vessels or anything, but he couldn't use his feet were numb. He had to take his feet off the pedals. So we finally get out of the area. We're not being shot at anymore, and we're taking. And about that time, we noticed that there's fire in an overhead circuit breaker panel, and a crew chief comes up. And he puts that out, and then we start heading back towards the MASH hospital at Quantry, and he couldn't. He was flying the cyclic and the collective, but he couldn't fly the pedals, so my feet were okay, so I was flying the pedals, which was really not all that much to do in cruise flight. And our crew chief had a round go into his 30 cal ammo box for his M60, and he had little tiny pinpricks of little brass, because it blew up several rounds in there. So he got a little dusting of brass. And so we headed for the MASH hospital, and it's funny the things that go through your mind when you're sitting there. I knew my arm was hit. I didn't know how bad, but I was holding it, and I moved my fingers. I didn't realize at the time I was only moving 2 of them, because these 3 were dead because of the nerve damage when the bullet went through. But I knew that I was bleeding, because I could see a steady stream of blood coming out of my elbow. And so I asked the crew chief, I said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Come up here. You know where the pressure point is in the armpit?" And he said, "I think so." I said, "Well, put your hand up in here and just feel around until you feel something that's thumping heartbeat-wise, and then press on it." And he did that, and sure enough, the trickle slowed down. So he probably saved my life, because the surgeon said if it had been another 15 minutes, I'd have bled out. In fact, the only time I got sick was when I looked down the chin bubble, and I could see my blood in there sloshing around from the movement of the aircraft. But I had this conscious thought, sitting there holding my arm, and that this might be the last flight I'll ever fly, so I better enjoy it. So I was sitting there looking around. Isn't that a stupid thing to? That's what shock does to you. It makes you think funny things. Anyway, we get into the helipad at the MASH hospital, and our hydraulics are out. We have no radios. Most of our electronics are out, but the engine kept running. The engine never stopped. And when we got in close to the ground, well, now without hydraulics, everything is very difficult to move. Not impossible, just difficult. You get a lot of feedback. And so as we started getting closer, and I was trying to keep us straight, with the pedals, and he was fighting with the cyclic and doing a good job with it, but we couldn't get the collective all the way down. So we came to about like a 10-foot hover, and everything was jittery. And so I finally told the crew chief, I said, reach over and push down with your foot on the collective, because we were both pushing down on it and we couldn't get it all the way down. And he did, and when he did, then all of a sudden it went all the way down. So we kind of landed very hard. It collapsed the skids, but it didn't chop off the tail boom. It really didn't matter, because some of the 50s went through some structural members of the aircraft, and they ended up taking it out over the South China Sea and dumping it in the water, because it was not repairable.
So now, okay, so this is April 1968. So you're wounded. So you came back to the States then?
I did. Yeah, I spent almost a month in Viet Nam and Japan, because the doctor said, and I got to thinking about this. I had the bullet wound in the arm, and if that had been World War II, that'd cut my arm off.
Yeah.
They just didn't have the skills and the techniques and the surgery and stuff like that. After I was back on active duty, which took 6 months, and then was stationed to Hunter Army Airfield, where the Cobras were.
Mm-hmm.
And I went out there, and I didn't have enough hours, really. They didn't think to be an instructor pilot, and they saw in my records that I had been an engineering aide. So they said, aha, maintenance, we're going to make you a maintenance officer. And I said, cool, okay. So I went out and flew what they called maintenance recovery, and that's where we would go out and try and fix or repair downed ships that had had a problem or a maintenance issue at the stage fields, because we didn't operate out of one single airport. The aircraft would stay at the main base, and then they would go out to stage fields. And at Hunter, I think we had 7 different stage fields, and that's where they would do the flight training. So I did
Interesting
that.
about helicopters. Probably an opportunity to pick them up, because airplanes, when they crash, that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
You don't fly those back.
Yeah.
At least you can land slow enough in a helicopter, so if something's wrong, you can get it down.
Yeah, if you don't mess up your auto rotation, generally there's not going to be anything wrong with the airplane.
How do you do an auto rotation?
Just reduce the pitch all the way down to the bottom, roll all the throttle off, trim up the aircraft, and it's a very stable mode of flight for helicopters. And what it does is it reverses the airflow through the main rotor system. So you're normally flying along, and it's sucking air into that big rotor system,
Right,
and pushing it out the back to keep you in the air and moving forward. In auto rotation, you reverse that airflow so that the aircraft is falling through the air, but that air is going through the rotor system, which keeps it spinning, which is a good thing. You want that inertia from those rotor blades. When you get down close to the ground, around 50, 60 feet, you pull the nose up to reduce your forward airspeed, and then when you get down to 10 to 15 feet, you start using those spinning blades that have the inertia in them with your collective, and you simply cushion it onto the ground.
and some rudder one way or another, I suppose.
Oh yeah. Rudder's almost inherent, because
Keep them.
the only time it's really difficult to auto rotate is if you do not have any open land. Then you can be falling through trees and stuff like that, and I've never had to experience that.
So how many auto rotations have you done? Hundreds?
In practice, absolutely, yeah.
For real?
For real, I did 7.
Really?
Yeah, I had 2 of them were in flight school. In fact, that was what I was talking about, the flight school with the slapping on the side of the aircraft for getting shot at. There was several things that from day one, when you started your flight school, is that you flew the helicopter, even though you were going in a straight line, you were always looking for, okay, there's a big field over there, and there's a highway over there, tennis courts over here, football field over here. Someplace you went from forced landing area to forced landing area to forced landing area. And it was so instinctive because the instructor pilots, you'd be just flying and he'd say, okay, well, let's go back to the stage field, and just as soon as you get everything, then he would reach over and chop off the throttle to see if you had a forced landing area in mind, could get the collective down, the throttle off, the pedals trimmed, and get the airplane set up, because auto rotation is a very steep approach. But they wanted you to always be thinking of where you're going to put that helicopter down if the engine quits, because we only had single engines back then.
Yeah.
And when I was like the last week or 2 weeks before we graduated out of Fort Walters, which was the primary flight training, and I was doing solo confined area, so I was by myself on an H-23 Raven, and I had already landed and did my thing on the ground, and then I had taken off, and it was on the south edge of Possum Kingdom Lake down by the dam. So there was a bit of a little cliff and then the water. And so I took off and I climbed up and I got my 1,000 feet and I started my left-hand crosswind turn. And just about the time I leveled off from that, everything went silent. And it wasn't a slow failure, it just stopped. The engine seized. So there I was, and heart in your throat.
So the engine, when the engine seizes, it breaks loose from the propeller.
Yes, there's a drive shaft that will engage in one direction and freewheels the other.
Okay.
So it doesn't stop the transmission,
Right.
which is what the rotor blades are attached
Right,
to.
yeah.
That's a good thing.
Would be a good idea.
Yeah. And what I remember was that after my panic subsided and I realized that the engine had failed, I started thinking, auto rotation. Well, I had already put the collective down. Okay, throttle. Got to turn throttle. The throttle was already off. Where am I going to land? There was a beach right dead in front of me. I had no conscious thought of doing any of those things. But that's how good the flight training was. It was automatic. And there it was. I zeroed my airspeed, landed on the beach, made my emergency call, and they came out and got me. No damage to the airplane.
Cool.
So that was the first one.
Okay, so now you went into the Cobra, though.
Yes.
And now when and how?
Again, it was right after flight school. I graduated well in flight school, so they gave me my my choice of an additional aircraft. Because coming out of flight school, you know how to fly the Huey, and that's it. So I was transitioned into the Cobra. Went to Army Airfield.
Okay, I was confused. I thought that when you were talking about before, I thought you were talking about flying the Huey as opposed to the Cobra. Because you talked about your co-pilot being right next to you.
Yes. Remember that I said that we had 2 B-model Huey gunships because the Cobras were grounded for night flying. And I was doing a last light recon, so I was flying one of the B-model gunships, which I was already rated in the Huey.
Okay, so it was a Huey gunship.
It was a Huey gunship,
Okay.
yes.
As opposed to the Cobra gunship,
Correct.
which is a Huey, but just a...
Well, it's a skinny Huey.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was purpose-built as a gunship, where the Huey was purpose-built to carry people and things.
And so, but he had your co-pilot had the head, what do you call that deal they put on their head so they can, where the gun shoots where they're aiming?
Not in those days. His had 2, it was a sight.
Okay.
It was a flexible sight, but
Right.
it was mounted to the overhead. And he had 2 little handles with triggers on them.
Okay.
And he could turn that back and forth. It had a sight displayed on it,
Okay.
from below. And that's what he used to fire the M60 machine guns on the side. But that was just in the Huey gunship, the B-model Huey gunship.
But then the pilot fired the rockets.
Yes.
You had those, 21, those pods would carry 21 rockets in them.
We didn't have that many. The Huey gunships had 7 rocket pods, 7 shot pods,
Right.
one on each side.
Right.
And the Cobras had the 7 or the 19. Our largest was a 19.
And then, now, when I talked to Woody Spring, he talked about something called a chucker. What the heck was
Yep.
that?
40 millimeter grenade launcher.
And that aimed out the front of the airplane? Or?
It was on the Hueys where we first started using the chucker. It was a pod that was built on the front. It was added on to the nose of the Huey. In the Cobra, it was built into the turret because the Cobra turret originally had just a single minigun, 6,000 round a minute 4,000 to 6,000 minigun, which was controlled by the front seat. And he had a sight, and he could, but this one had, you know, it did like 180 degree azimuth and 60 degrees up, 90 degrees down, stuff like that. Very effective gun on the Cobra. And then they moved the minigun over and put a 40 millimeter grenade launcher right beside it.
How big is 40 millimeter?
And it's about that big around.
Okay.
So it was essentially it was a hand grenade. Each round was a hand grenade. Well, remember the job of bunker busting and industrial complex destroying and ammo dumps was the Air Force. We are tactical. We are close in. So we're looking at personnel and equipment.
So this is it's a grenade. In other words, it's going to come apart and put shrapnel all over the place.
Yes, that's all it did. But it was such low velocity that in the Cobra it was almost useless. Because by the time you would fire 5 or 6 rounds to figure out how you needed to adjust your sights based on your bank and your airspeed, the rounds were they were still in the air. They weren't hitting. So you'd have to bump, 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 and then you'd have to watch them. Okay, I need a little bit higher. Bump, bump, bump. Didn't work real good with the Cobra. The Hueys were better because they were not as fast.
So were they visible? Could you see them in
Oh
flight?
yeah.
Something that big.
That's how slow they were.
Yeah. Wow.
I don't remember exactly what their muzzle velocity was, but it wasn't that great.
Yeah. I remember.
Even the 30 cal machine guns, you can see that. Well, most of the time you can see those because of the tracers.
Yeah.
If we had tracers with them, but yeah, you can see a whole
Well, when
stream
you
of
fire
them going out.
a stream of tracers, though, the bullets that aren't tracers fly at a slightly different trajectory, right? Because a tracer is, well, first of all, it's got some sort of powder or something on the outside, which probably slows it down a little bit.
No, it just has a magnesium core in the back. A little bit of magnesium in the back of the bullet.
Well, doesn't it, as it goes away, doesn't it then lighten the bullet and make the bullet go higher? Or is it covered close enough for government work?
it may, but the difference in trajectory is academic.
Yeah, okay.
And utilization doesn't make any difference.
Yeah.
Especially in the minigun, because you know one every, I can't remember if it's one every 4 bullets or one every 6 bullets is a tracer. But in the minigun you could have more than that, because the problem with the tracer was it heated up the barrel more than a regular round did. But you know when you're throwing 4,000 rounds a minute, you know that's like what, 60 bullets per second.
So
that's a lot of stuff going on.
When you just do small bursts, just boop 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 sort of thing, or you just hold the trigger down and spray it?
3 seconds.
3 seconds.
That was the rule.
Yeah.
In the Cobra, different armament systems are different on different aircraft. In the Cobra, where the turret was in the front, where the ammo box was in the back, there was about 7 feet of ammo chute
Right.
between the ammo box and the gun. And if you did short bursts, it would tend to cause those links to pull apart.
Oh wow.
And you didn't want to go too long of a burst, because you only had, you know, you're firing 4,000 rounds a minute, and you got 8,000 rounds of ammunition.
Sure.
So you've got 2 minutes of firepower, and that's it.
Yeah.
On the wing-mounted miniguns, there was only 1,500 rounds, and there were, again, 4,000 rounds a minute. So you had like 18 seconds worth of firepower from those.
Yeah.
But they were very accurate, because they were bolted to the aircraft, and you could aim the entire airplane before you start firing.
So when did you check out in the Cobra then?
Right after flight school. Right out of flight school.
Okay. But then, okay, I'm sort of confused. So you went to Viet Nam and you flew the regular.
No. I graduated from flight school, went to Hunter Army Airfield, got checked out in the Cobra. Then I went to Vietnam. In Vietnam, the company I was in had, I think we had a total of 12 Cobras, but we had 2 B model gunships for night missions.
Right.
So the day I got shot was, in fact, it was only my second time flying one of the B models. But the rest of the time I was flying the Cobra.
Oh, okay, all right.
And then in the second tour, I went over, and it was an air cav troop, so we had Cobras, Hueys, and Loaches. So that was a little different.
What was the
scenario.
combination? Why that combination? I get the Loach understand to look for things, but the Hueys to pick up survivors.
CNC, command and control.
Really?
Yeah. So the Loaches would be down in the trees looking for Charlie, trying to get shot at, so that they would identify where they were at. The Huey was at 1,500 feet, and that had the AMC, the Air Mission Commander. The guy was in charge of the package. And then at 3,000 feet was the 2 Cobras, or 3 Cobras if it was a heavy fire team. When the Loaches took fire and identified, and they had smoke grenades they would chuck out, sometimes they would just return fire. Within 6 seconds, you'd have rockets inbound, because the Cobras would, the lead Cobra would just immediately snap in, go into a gun run, and start punching off rockets.
What kind of airspeed on the attack run?
You'd usually start 80, 90 knots, and then you'd have to pull out 160, 170,
Oh, that fast.
190 sometimes. The
Okay.
V&E was 190, but we all knew it would do 210 almost all the time.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
How does it change
These were knots.
How does it change the air performance of the airplane now?
The airspeed?
Yeah. Does it when you get to really high airspeed? Does the flying characteristics change at all?
No. The only thing you have to worry about is what's called a retreating blade stall, and that's when your forward airspeed is going so fast that the relative wind of your retreating blade is at such a high pitch, because it's trying to keep a balanced load on the rotor system,
Right.
that it will stall. And when it stalls, the aircraft will start to roll left, and the nose will pitch up a little bit. So it's almost self-correcting when you get into that.
You mean it'll pull itself out? And,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so do the propeller blades change speeds then? Or is
Nope.
it stays the same. It's a constant pitch or constant.
It's constant speed, variable pitch.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the limiting speed of a helicopter is about 200 miles an hour, isn't it?
Yeah, a little more sometimes.
Because of the retreating blade business,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. And there are some
When you-
aircraft,
when you
some
look at a-
helicopters that'll go faster than that, but they have stubby wings, and I can't remember all the models, and I don't know if any of them were actually got operational use. But what they would do is they would actually slow down the main rotor, and the stub wings would take up some of the lift characteristics for the aircraft.
Right. How much does the Cobra weigh?
Basic weight is about 5,500 to 5,800 pounds.
Oh, wow.
And then max gross is, the G models we had, I think, was 9,500 pounds. So you got about 4,000 pounds worth of ammunition and fuel that you can take on.
So the Cobra had the same sort of armament inside, panels and things you could pull up around your... Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And how many missions did you fly in the Cobra?
Who knows?
Lots, huh?
Yeah, 400 hours worth.
Oh.
So and each mission's usually an hour and a half,
Oh, wow.
about 90 minutes. From an hour to an hour and a half.
So you came home, recovered, and went back over again.
Mm-hmm.
And when did you get back over there?
71, mid 71.
Oh, it was like 3 years later.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Was it because of your injuries or other jobs?
I really don't know. It
Really?
was, I mean, once I got out of the hospital and got checked out to recertified to fly, I had to do a demonstrated capabilities, because I did have nerve damage in this hand, and when the nerve came back, I got most of my muscles back, but I permanently lost 3 of them. So I had to do a demonstrated ability to make sure I could do everything in the cockpit that I had to do. So once I got back on flight status, then yeah, it was a couple of years later that I went back over.
How'd you get over there? How'd you get there?
Did
Did they fly over to 707 or something like that, or 135, or?
707 Flying Tiger, first tour, and second tour, and then I came back in a Air Force 141. I was medevaced out, and then second tour.
How about the other guy?
I think it was probably 707s.
What happened to the other guy? The other, your left seater in that?
I don't know.
Honestly, really?
Yeah, I mean, I was out of it for like 2 days before I finally became conscious, and then because of the nerve damage. You know when you hit your crazy
Sure.
bone?
Right.
Well, that's the way this arm felt continuously for 6 months. So I was taking the strongest oral painkiller that the Army had. It's called Darvon 65, and max dose was 2 tablets every 4 hours, and I was taking 4 tablets every 2 hours, and I did that for 6 months.
Well, you're a big guy.
So, but then in
So,
fact they
but
were.
you don't know what was the other guy's name?
Don't know. I hadn't been in the unit but less than a month.
Wow.
Yeah, we didn't have the same. You know, your max crew in a helicopter is 4 people. So eventually you would get to know all of your pilots, because each company would have 80 to 90 pilots. So as you drew a mission, and they would assign the crew, and then you would get to meet the other guys. So it wasn't a crew setting. You didn't fly with the same co-pilot all the time. You flew with someone different every time. The crew chief stayed with his own airplane.
Okay.
So if you got tail number 550 this week, next week you have 550 again, it'd be the same crew chief.
And the door gunner, does he stay with the airplane?
Door gunners would rotate.
So so when I ask you if you had a fixed crew, you really didn't have a crew.
No.
Okay.
I mean, fixed composition of crew, but the people changed continuously.
Go to work in the morning. It's in Viet Nam when you're finally over there, 71 or so.
Mm-hmm.
This time you were there and didn't get shot up, or didn't get shot down, or didn't get wounded apparently.
Didn't get hit, yeah.
Didn't get hit. So how long were you there that time?
12 months.
You were there towards the thing when things were winding down a bit,
Yep.
I guess, yeah. Bullet hits the engine. Will they penetrate an engine?
It will. Oh
Okay.
yeah. It'll take out an engine.
What happens to the
Yeah,
engine? Does it
and,
continue to run, or?
I'm sorry?
Well, if it doesn't hit a turbine, does the engine continue to run, or just not run as
Depends
well?
on where it hits. Normally, you know, the engines had armor plates on the
Okay.
sides of them, and on the base of them. Our seats were armored.
Right.
We had armor on the bottom, on the sides, up the back, and then we had a small little piece that we would slide forward. I was flying right seat, and then my left seat would have one on his side.
Oh, cool.
And anyway, we started getting multiple hits in the aircraft, and we could, which is kind of an interesting story, because in flight school, in the advanced portion at Fort Rucker, which were all Vietnam veterans, we would have the instructor would tell us to go into a particularly small confined area, and they were always training us to do a couple things. Number one, always look for a safe forced landing area, and number two, always fly the aircraft. And they would actually, when you were on short final, they would start slapping the side of the airplane. And what was that? Fly the airplane, they'd say. Oh, fly the airplane.
Yeah,
That's what
yeah.
that's what they taught us. And they even, some of the instructors even had little pieces of hose, rubber hose, that they would take out, and they would beat us on top of the helmet. Everybody
Wow.
thought that was cruel and unusual punishment. But I tell you, the first time I felt rounds come through my aircraft, I knew exactly what they were doing. I knew exactly what to do, because I'd been trained that way. Flight school training was very good.
So,
yeah, we pulled out in '75, so April '75.
and you were there till 72, late
Mhm.
72.
Mid '72, yeah.
Um,
So, and I was a maintenance officer the second tour. So I was a test pilot, and that kept me kind of busy, because I had to test not only our Cobras, but
oh, so you weren't
Cobras.
flying active missions then?
I would fly the active mission at least once a week,
Okay,
just to keep my hand in.
right.
And my roommate was the Cobra platoon commander, and I was the service platoon commander. So, and we bunked together. So I would go out and fly his trail, like I said, about once a week.
His trail?
His number 2. We'd always go out in at least a pair of Cobras, sometimes 3.
Okay, so all right, so it's a morning briefing. And you're gonna be flying that day. What?
Okay.
how would it go? Tell me how you would know what you were going to do that day.
You go into the ops in the morning. You look at the assignment board the night before, and you find out if you're assigned, which aircraft, what the time, sometimes who you're going to be flying with. I can't remember that very clearly. And then at the assigned time, it could be 4 o'clock in the morning, it could be 5, it depends on the mission parameters. You would meet your crew in what we call a TOC, T-O-C, Tactical Operations Center. You would get the latest intel on the mission for the enemy situation, where the 50 cals were at, where the 23 cals were at, 37s, etc. And then you'd head to the flight line. So that's when you get your frequencies, make sure you had your current maps and the things that you needed.
So then you would take off as a package then?
Yes.
So you have the Loach, the Huey.
Minimum of 5 aircraft on each time on the package. You'd have
2 Hueys.
No, you'd have 2 Loaches.
2 Loaches, okay.
Yeah, 1 Huey and 2 Cobras.
Were they on UHF or VHF?
UHF. And we do have the FM for ground contact.
And so did you ever fly a Loach?
Oh yeah.
What was it like?
It was the only airplane I know that you don't climb into, you strap it on. It is extremely responsive. My maintenance aircraft, well actually I had 2 of them, was a Loach and a Huey. And if I was going to go get big parts out of Vung Tau, I'd take the Huey, and if I was going to go try and scrounge some stuff, I'd take the Loach.
It's a 2-seater.
4-seat.
4.
Yeah.
Is it about the size of the Ranger downstairs? Or whatever that thing is downstairs.
The Robinson?
Yeah.
Actually, yeah. It's a little bit larger in girth than the Robinson, but and a much more powerful engine. Of course, it was turbine engine.
How fast did it go?
Probably 120, 130.
So you go to a sector, and then what was the idea in the sector? Was searching things in specific, or?
Yeah, we would have we would stage at some usually either a U.S. base, a ground infantry base, or an ARVN base, and we would all meet up there, and we would top off our fuel tanks, and then we would get a briefing from the ground commander, and the ground commander would say, okay, for instance, we suspect on this area, this forest over here, that we've got a North Vietnamese regiment, battalion, whatever it was, in that area, and we would like to get some intelligence and see if they're out there and what they're doing, and shoot as many of them as you can while you're there. So then our package would take off again. The scouts, once we got to the area, the scouts would go low level, the Loaches, and they would start sneaking around and start looking for signs of habitation, signs of bunkers.
Well, didn't you have intel from?
Oh yeah.
From
that's how we knew that they were in that area, but now we wanted to go shoot them. So it was called a search and destroy mission.
Okay.
So we would go out there and we would search, and whatever the Loaches would find on the ground, if they found bunkers, sometimes they could blow the bunkers, sometimes they would just move out of the way. They'd mark it with smoke, and we'd have the Cobras come in and try and take it out with
any coordination
rockets.
with the Air Force or Navy?
No.
Not at all.
No, this was all tactical. So we were at the command of the ground commander.
The guys the guys flying F-100s and the guys flying A-1s and stuff like that. They were tactical too.
They were, and we could call them in if we found a large area.
Okay.
Like if we got into an area where we started taking massive fire, then we would break off and we'd call Sandy. And Sandy was the Air Force and the Navy sometimes that would be flying around in A-1s, A-4s, and we would call them and say, hey, we got a target for you. And they said, hey, where are you at? We'd give them coordinates, they'd give us an estimate, and they'd come in there with their 5-inchers.
How much did the resistance changed after they came in with their napalm and things like that?
Quite a bit.
A lot.
Yeah.
There was some. Did you watch that Vietnam series when it was on TV?
I've watched some of them. There was like an 8-part on PBS,
Yeah.
and I watched the first 3 of those, and I learned nothing from them. And for a long time, for probably 30 years after that, I had some PTSD issues, which were solved mostly by just don't think about it. But if I would do a discussion like we're having right now, it'd be a couple nights that I would not be able to sleep well.
Wow. I'm sorry.
But that's been, you know, it's just something you live with. You know, part of the game.
Yeah. I just want to. I know they. You know, they were talking about some of those gigantic battles, and well, I can't remember what they had where Dien Bien Phu, where the French thought, oh, we're going to really get them here.
They got run
and they got down in the valley, but then all the Viet Cong came up, and then basically and we had the same thing happen.
Yep.
And the same
Many
place,
times.
I think.
Mm-hmm.
But I just wondered what.
One of the problems with the tactical support by Sandy was good because they usually had the 5-inch rockets, which were very powerful, very accurate, and they could do a lot of pinpoint stuff, but not really that much. And so the basic issue is you've got U.S. troops and you've got Viet Cong troops or North Vietnamese troops, and they're within 100 yards, 200 yards at the most of each other. They're right there. So, in fact, I remember an alert mission that I went out on, and we were going to the LRPs, and they were in contact when we got there.
Going to the what?
LRP, long-range patrols. These were guys usually 6 to 12, sometimes 15, Rangers, special ops guys. And they would go out and work in the area to get intelligence. And then they would usually stay in there 4 or 5 days, and then we would go back in and pick them up and take them out. And we were doing alert extraction. And the ground commander, was on his FM radio, and he was whispering. He said, I'm in contact, battalion size unit. They're 50 yards to our north. 50 yards to our north. I said, Roger that. Pop smoke. He popped smoke, identified. Okay. So I started going in 50 yards across, and this was across a creek. and I made, in my trail, or actually I was trail, we both made a pass and put in probably 6 or 8 pair, we had 19 shot pods of rockets, and as we pulled out, we asked him, did that help? And he says, yeah, but there's a lot of them, they're still over there. So we did 2 more passes, and we were about expended, so we called Sandy, and we had 2 A4s, and they had the 5-inch rockets. And they came in, and we told them what the layout was, and they said, Roger that, and they put those 5-inch rockets in there. Well, the burst radius on a 2.75 is, 20 meters. And these guys, the bad guys, are like 50 meters or so north of our ground troops. Well, the 5-inch rockets start going in there, and all of a sudden, now the ground commander's yelling. He said, cease fire, cease fire, you're right on top of us. And the Sandy said, well, you asked for 50 meters, you got 50 meters. That's how accurate they were. Wow. And we told them, this is where you... And as I saw the rockets going in, I said, oh, that's perfect. That's exactly where we told them. But the explosion was so much larger than our little 2.75-inch rockets that it scared the heck out of the ground commander. And we finally got the team out of there. But that's the type of closeness that, you couldn't put napalm in there. You couldn't put a 500-pounder in there. You'd wipe out all of our people. Of course,
another friend of mine who flew A1s over there, he said he dropped some, what do you call them? Flechettes or something like that. That were basically just little bullets that came out, finned bullets, and just nothing on them. They just went,
they were nails.
Basically, yeah.
With little fins on them, and that's what we called them, because we had those on the Cobra.
Yeah.
We use them a lot for buildings, because in my second tour, we weren't supposed to shoot at the buildings, because they were all, of course, historic Buddha monuments or something like that. And that's where Charlie would get into those places, and they'd just be sitting there, firing away at us. But we could use nails, because you could set, there was a setting on your panel at what proximity the rocket is going to fire the nails, and they come out. They're fired out of the nose cone of of the rocket, and of course they all have these little fins on them, so they're quite effective. And you could
never heard of that before.
Yeah, fire a couple nails at a building or something like that, and anybody that was, I mean, there's thousands of nails in these things, so it's pretty effective of suppressing.
So if there's an open window or a grass hut.
Yeah, unless they're out of the range of those things, and they penetrate. I mean, they'll go through, I think, like half-inch sheet of plywood. Anything thicker than that stops them. But yeah, they're pretty effective. It's like a bird shot shotgun.
So how come we didn't win?
Politicians. They gave it away.
I just